Hey everybody, Corey here, coming at you with another knife review video. This time it is of the Sebenza 31, the large Chris Reeve Knives Sebenza 31. If I sound tired, it's because I am. It's because I am now on take 8, and I'm even getting sick of saying this, of filming this video. It's hard to say everything I want to say about the Sebenza without going on like a huge rant trying to justify what I'm trying to say. Here's the extremely short version that I've come down to after doing this 8 times. The large Sebenza is a great knife, but in my opinion, it is absolutely not worth the money that you pay, whether you pay for a non-inlay version or an inlay version, relative to the competition that exists today at the end of 2021. And that's a key point there, okay? There's no doubt in my mind that when the Sebenza came out over a decade ago, that it blew the competition out of the water. And I could totally say, yes, it's worth 3 times as much. Yes, it's worth 4 times as much as whatever you've got in your pocket right now, okay? Over a decade ago. The problem is not that Sebenzas have gotten worse. The problem for the Sebenza is that other knives have gotten significantly better. The Sebenza has not fallen behind. Other knives have caught up, okay? Is there $550 worth of work into this Sebenza? Maybe. Is it worth double, say, a ZT? I don't think so. Is it worth double a Rayot? I don't think so. Is it worth double or triple a Benchmade? Is it worth double or triple a Spyderco? I just don't think so. Those knives are there, right? And back in the day, when you'd look at a Sebenza and people would say the tolerances are crazy and it's gonna last you your entire life, unlike whatever you've got in your pocket, and you know, blah, blah, blah. All the arguments that people used to make. And the action is so smooth. Yeah, action's really smooth. Tolerances are really tight, and it is going to last you probably your entire life unless you seek destruction. But the fact of the matter is, again, back in the day, you might not have been able to say that about the majority of the competition. But today, who do you know who buys a Civivi and says, you know, oh, it's great, but it probably won't last me my entire life? Or who buys a Spyderco Paramilitary 2 and says it's great, but the tolerances aren't that great and it's not that smooth and it won't last me my entire life? Keep going, right? The Benchmades, the ZTs, the Rayots. No, there are so many people out there who live and die by their $150 knives, their $70 knives, and they're fine and they're great, right? The Sebenza is fine, and the Sebenza is great. But the qualities that used to make the Sebenza stand out because they were almost exclusive to the Sebenza are no longer exclusive to the Sebenza. So you end up finding yourself in a situation where you're scratching your head and you're saying, so what am I paying for now? Because I can get the same qualities in knives that are a fraction of the price, okay? Into the positive for a second. I need to remind you, this is a great knife. This is a totally great knife, and it's probably gonna stay in my collection. It's probably going to stay in my collection. It's an icon for the knife world. I don't feel like I necessarily got ripped off. That being said, you can get something extremely comparable, 99% of the way there, for a third or half the price. Okay, there's no doubt in my mind that companies are cranking out amazing stuff at a fraction of what a Sebenza is going to cost you. Takeaway for you as someone who is considering buying a Sebenza. I'm not saying a Sebenza is bad. I'm not saying it's not worth the price. It just struggles now when you start putting it side by side with other knives, especially other knives that start creeping up towards this price point. It just doesn't blow everybody out of the water anymore. If you've been eyeing a Sebenza, if you think you're going to like a Sebenza, if you're a knife collector and you've just got that itch and you're never going to let it die until you get a Sebenza in your hand, go ahead and buy one. You're not going to be disappointed. There's no doubt in my mind that the quality is there. But you might be disappointed if you're expecting to stack this up against everything else in your collection and have your mind blown, okay? I don't think that's going to happen. As someone who's handled quite a few knives, probably more knives than, I collect knives, I review knives. I probably handle more knives than the average person. This, at no point in my relationship with this knife, let's call it, did I ever go, oh my God, that is by far the best action, or oh my God. The only thing I can say, tolerances are there, right? This is one of the few knives in my collection that I go, wow, like, I know I've said knives have no blade play before, but this is as solid as it comes. This is really, really, really no blade play. But does it blow the other knives out of the water? I just can't say that, right? Stick around for the rest of the video, right? I've got good things to say about this knife, and I've got a few bad things to say about this knife specifically. From a value perspective, is it there? No, not from a value perspective, especially when you start sticking it up against competition. From a quality perspective, is it there? Absolutely. You are not going to feel like you got scammed when you buy this knife. You see it in the design, you see it in the finish on the knife, you feel it in the action, and you feel it in the lockup. You know you're not getting scammed. It's just not going to be the one knife to rule them all anymore. That time has passed. There are a lot of other great knives out there. But again, if you want it, go get it. It's going to be great. If you have reservations, stick around and consider some of the other things I have to say about this knife. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Enjoy the rest of the video. All right, as always, let's start with some size comparisons. Here it is next to my conventionally large knife, the off-grid knife Scorpion. Only comes in about 1/4 of an inch smaller than the off-grid knife Scorpion in overall length. Here it is next to the Ontario Knives Rat number 2, comes in about 1 inch longer than the Rat 2. I will post the specifications on the screen after this. At my wonderful father's request, I have decided to also include a few other size comparisons, knives that you may have seen before in your travels. So let's move this down here. Here it is next to the Benchmade Mini Crooked River. Here it is next to the Kershaw Link. Here it is next to the Hogue Deca. And here it is next to a ProTech Malibu. All right, specs coming up on the screen. Alright everyone, so before I get into the tabletop review, which I filmed yesterday actually, it just occurred to me that I don't think I addressed the elephant in the room, which is smoothness of action on a Sebenza. It's probably the #1 thing that everyone who loves their Sebenza talks about, is they say you'll never find a knife that is this smooth. Now, I want to remind you, I own this knife. I bought this knife. I paid $550 for this knife. If anyone wants this knife to be the smoothest knife that they own, it's me. This is the most expensive knife in my collection. Okay, so you damn well know that I hope it's the smoothest knife that I have. I can tell you right now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it is not. It is just not. And as a matter of fact, I have 5 examples right next to me that I'm about to show you that have a smoother action than the Sebenza. Now let me preface this by saying this is still like an 8.5 out of 10, okay? But I got 9.5s right over here at a fraction of the price. Let's show you some. Here's a relatively comparable one in terms of materials and location, origin. This is the Tor Knives Merchant. This is the Shadow Black model. It is also titanium. It is S35VN. It's got thumb studs and it's running on phosphor bronze washers. So smooth, glass on glass. Next up, Giant Mouse Ace Sonoma. Get that focus. There we go. Same thing. Smooth, glass on glass. Next up, Reich 1902 BCF. Beautiful knife. Stunning knife. There we go. There we go. Glass on glass. Civivi Statera. We're coming in at the sub $100 mark at this point. Check that out. Glass on glass, and then finally, at a whopping $40, my Ontario Knives Rat number 2. I'm just being honest with you guys. My Rat 2 is smoother than my large Sebenza. Sebenza's a little jumpy. It's a little gluey. It's just a little sandy. It's smooth. It's very smooth. Objectively, it's just not the smoothest knife in my collection. I would love for it to be. I've worked the action. I've used the knife. I've tried running it with oil. I've tried running it with grease. I've tried running it dry. I've tried loosening the pivot screw. I've tried tightening the pivot screw. It's just not the smoothest knife that I own. So I wanted to get that out of the way before we go into the official review, because I think it's, you know, a big deal. I think it's one of those things where a lot of people who love their Sebenzas and who maybe haven't experimented a lot with knives that have been made in recent times, again, no doubt in my mind that action would have been absolutely mind-blowing over a decade ago. But the things that have come out since then, you know, that's all I'm gonna say. All right. Moving to the tabletop portion. Okay guys, so this is going to be my first video with my new format. That format is I'm going to present you with 3 things that I think the Sebenza specifically does well, and 3 things that I think the Sebenza specifically could improve upon. So the first thing I want to comment on, even though it might feel like a cop-out, is the design and the tolerances in this knife. So let's take a look at 2 things that kind of stand out to me to illustrate this point. Look at the blade for a second here. If you are paying attention, you might see that right around here, there is a very, very slight change in the angle of the blade, or the spine. And it might be easier to see like this right there at the tip of my fingernail. Right about here, it starts to shift into a different angle, moving into that drop point. Functionally, you might not notice a difference in this knife versus any other knife in your collection. But it's things that are like this that add up cumulatively to come to a point where you get a knife where even though you can't put your finger on it, it feels different and it feels good. Let me show you one thing in specific to illustrate this. Get this out of the frame. Here is my Reate Knives new Torrent. Yes, I know, it is beautiful. One thing that a lot of knives don't do, or a lot of makers don't do on their knives, the top of the lock bar, they don't chamfer the top of the lock bar. Now, of course, you shouldn't chamfer the part that interfaces with the tang of the blade, but a lot of times, just like in this Reate new Torrent, you get this sharp edge right here. And sometimes you can feel that sharp edge in the knife. It pokes into your finger and you feel it. It's not the biggest deal, but you feel it. It's those kinds of things that when it comes to the Sebenza, you just don't even have to think about it. Look at that. They chamfered the top of the lock bar. And what that does is that when your hand is up here, you will never, ever feel a hot spot at the top of the lock bar. It's little design choices like this that flow through the entire knife. The pocket clip on this one is canted. This is something that's new for the 31s as opposed to the 21s. One of the things that people complain about on the Sebenzas is that they say it's crazy that there's not an over travel stop. But there kind of is an over travel stop. It's the pocket clip, right? The pocket clip is resting both on the frame and it's also resting on the lock bar, right? When this lock bar is disengaged, it's up against the pocket clip. What does that mean? That means that if you want to push this lock bar beyond the point of the frame, beyond being flush with the frame, yeah, it's not perfect, but you have to overcome the pressure that's being exerted by the pocket clip, right? It's things like that. This pocket clip is kind of functioning as an over travel stop. And if you think that wasn't thought about, you're wrong. You're just wrong. These little lines here for a relief cut on the outside of the lock bar, even though the main relief cut is on the inside of the lock bar, it's these little things that have been thought about that make this knife as great as it is, that give it the reputation that it has. So that's the first thing, the design and the tolerances. If you want more information on the tolerances, go take a look at the Blade HQ shop tour where Chris Reeve himself talks about the tolerances of these knives and how ridiculously tight the tolerances are. Whether or not those tolerances are necessary is a different discussion, but you will understand more about what you're paying for if you watch those videos. The second thing that I wanted to talk about that I think the Sebenza does really well, that I wish a lot of other knives would kind of take after, the simplicity of the maintenance of this knife, okay? I think anybody who has disassembled their knives knows that sometimes they can just be a pain. Sometimes screws, they screw into the backspacer in a way that you wouldn't expect, or they screw all the way through and you can't take apart the entire knife unless you take out every single screw on both sides of the knife, or sometimes you have to take out the pocket clip to get out this side, whatever the case might be, right? Here's the thing, with the Sebenza, if I want to clean the blade, if I want to clean the pivot area, the only screw, the one screw that you need to take out is the pivot screw. You take this screw out, you pop the other side out, and you can remove the blade, okay? And here's the interesting thing. A lot of you who are used to taking apart your knives, you know that you can't just slip a blade in there because it's too hard, and the washers or the bearings, they come falling out. Can't do it, right? Well, guess what? Going back to number one, those tolerances that we were talking about. Everything is so tight. Everything is so close together with the Sebenza that all you have to do after you've taken the blade out and the handle is still assembled, all you have to do is pinch the washers like this with your finger and slide them and just get them to the point where they're both under these scales, and they will just stay together all the way to the pivot. You just get those washers, you pinch them, you push the knife in, you line up the pivot, you line up the hole, and you can just push the other side through. This is by far the easiest knife to maintain, the easiest knife to disassemble. It is actually a good time. I feel so happy when I take apart this knife because it's so easy and it makes me go, oh my gosh, I don't dread doing that. I don't have to think about anything. So that's the second one. The third good thing about the Sebenza, on a knife that costs this much, you never want to think about whether or not you're going to be able to take care of it. You never want to think about whether or not it's going to be serviceable, right? Chris Reeve, as many of you know, the company offers what they refer to as a spa day. You send them their knife, or you send them your knife, they will re-sandblast the handle, they'll re-polish your inlays, they'll replace any parts that you have missing, or just anything. You got a problem with your thumb stud, they'll fix it. You got a problem with your blade, they'll resharpen it. Anytime you can just send your knife to Chris Reeve, and I can tell you I have personally dealt with Chris Reeve customer service. They are extremely responsive, and they absolutely positively do truly care about whatever it is that your problem might be. They do an amazing job responding to any questions that you might have, and they will take care of you. That's really nice, because a lot of people, they don't have a ton of money lying around to spring for a knife like this, and it's really nice to know that you're just never going to have to worry about the integrity of your knife as long as Chris Reeve Knives is in business. Okay, let's talk about the bad. I'm going to get the elephant in the room out of the way first. The value, okay? Specifically, the value compared to other knives that are options on the market now. Okay, so you saw in my summary how I felt about this knife, specifically in relation to other knives. Other knives have simply caught up to what the Sebenza does, okay? And I will reference my Rayot one more time, okay? This is the Rayot New Torrent, okay? These go for about $375 new. You actually can't really get them too much anymore. Let me move this light out of the way. There we go. That's nice. These went for about $375 when they were brand new. And let's get the Sebenza out of the picture for a second. Let's look at this work here. Look at that anodization, the slight stone wash on the entire blade. Look at that carbon fiber inlay with that anodized titanium inlay inside of the carbon fiber inlay. Look at those matching anodized hardware screws. Look at the seamless pocket clip. Look at this backspacer. Look at the machined little detail on the backspacer, anodized just within the divots. Look at this beautiful titanium pocket clip. Look at the milling here. Look at the ceramic ball. Look at the lock bar insert that also functions as an over travel stop. Look at all these things. And oh, by the way, look at this action. And oh, by the way, the lockup on this, tank. Absolute tank. Okay? So, oh, and by the way, where is it? Where does it say it? RWL34, a steel so premium that you basically don't even hear about it at this point in time. What am I trying to say? Okay? You put this up against this. I know that when you put these side by side, it's kind of like apples and oranges from a design perspective. But when you look at the materials, when you look at the fit and finish, when you look at the extra things that have gone into this, have you ever seen an inlay inside of an inlay? Oh, by the way, a machined, right? A textured inlay inside of an inlay, okay? There's a lot going on here with the Rayot. And it's not to say that the Sebenza isn't good, remember? But when you shave off $100 and you can get this, or in this case, because this has an inlay, you shave off $200 and you get this. It's so hard, right? It's so hard to look at the Sebenza and make the claim that it is leagues beyond this Rayot. If I'm being completely honest, they're probably on the same exact playing field. If I'm being completely honest, I have arguments to make where I would place the Rayot above the Sebenza, but we're not going to get into that. What I'm talking about here is a cost versus value perspective. And as long as knives like this exist and are being made by very reputable companies, it's so hard to point at a Sebenza and say, yes, I would definitely recommend you get this instead of this. It's not a question of, do I recommend that you get this? It's a question of, do I recommend that you get this as long as things like this exist? Two different things. The next thing I want to talk about and where I think the Sebenza could improve, the upcharge for upgrades. Now, you might remember when I was comparing it to the Rayot, I said you can get this for $100 less or $200 less. Let's talk about why. A plain Jane Sebenza right now, and I believe this has always been the case in terms of the cost difference between a plain Jane and an inlay Sebenza, but right now, Plain Jane Sebenza is going to run you $450. To get an inlay, you pay an extra $100. Do you see $100 there? That's really, really hard for me. That is a really hard sell. $100 extra just to get an inlay. Now I'll tell you why I got the inlay. Something that most people don't think about is that the inlays actually add thickness to the knife. I knew that a plain Jane Sebenza was a little too thin for me. I like the thickness that an inlay adds. That's why, even though I don't necessarily support the price increase, the difference between a plain Jane and an inlay model, I still bought the inlay model because I knew that I wanted the thickness. I think it's absolutely ludicrous to pay an extra $100 for the inlays. I think maybe you could justify $50. I think the reason that they don't offer the inlays at a closer price to a plain Jane is that everyone would pick inlays over plain Janes if given the option. I think that $100 makes a big difference for a lot of people, and it should make a difference in whether or not you're considering buying this knife, because it is so nice to have, but it's so expensive relative to what other companies charge you for minor things like a model with an inlay in it. All right, the third thing that unfortunately drives me crazy about this knife, and it's just the way it is. Oh, this thumb stud. Oh, this thumb stud is just so uncomfortable, and it's so ineffective, and it's like, it's machined, but it's so slippery, and the top just comes to this ball. It's not even really a point, and there's just no aggressive machining there, and it's just so hard to get a decent grip on it, and it's just so... When you combine it with the Chris Reeve action, which is very smooth, but it's very stiff, you know, the best way to access this thumb stud is to really just dig your thumb into it, because you have to, right? You have to dig your thumb into it because it doesn't have a lot of grip on it. It blows my mind that they're still making the Sebenza with the thumb stud that I think like everybody complains about the thumb stud. Like every review has to talk about the thumb stud, and yes, I am going to talk about the thumb stud, even though everyone else has already beat it to death, because it's so relevant. It's so true. My thumb, the callus on my thumb that I have developed since owning the Sebenza is just bonkers, and I totally understand what Sebenza thumb really means. So if it was up to me, I've seen people swap those out for Benchmade thumb studs, and I have no problem with that. I really think Chris Reeve knives need to start offering a different thumb stud option for these knives, because this one is truly uncomfortable and is nowhere near as functional as it could be. So again, guys, overall, it's a great knife. It's still a great knife, but I feel like we live in a market where the competitors are so close, and they offer knives that are close enough, or honestly the same, if not better, than a Sebenza right now at lower prices. If there's something here that you say, you know what, I'm willing to spring for that. If you love the design and you can only get it on a Sebenza, if you want to support, you know, the USA, something made in the USA, good for you. If that's a choice that you want to make, you are more than allowed to do that. And again, it's not that I'm saying I couldn't recommend this knife to someone. It's about saying, could I recommend this knife to someone over even the off-grid knife Scorpion, right? S35VN titanium. It's got inlays. It's got machining. Yeah, maybe the tolerances aren't exactly the same, but this knife is not going to fail you, okay? And at almost a third of the price of a Sebenza with inlays, can you justify that? Can you say that there is 3 times the knife here compared to here? I can't. I really can't. But that being said, the Sebenza is still an amazing knife. I think it still has its place in the knife world. I do think it's time for Chris Reeve Knives to come up with something a little bit more modern. I think it's time for them to change and adapt. I think they can get away with keeping the Sebenza in their lineup, but I think it's time. I think it's time we've seen a new knife from Chris Reeve Knives and it needs to be in line with everything else that's out there in the market. I'd love to see what Chris Reeve would do with, say, bearings, something like that. But until then, you know, it's still a great knife. It's just as other companies catch up, it's really hard to justify. So I hope you guys found this entertaining. Hope you found it useful. I will see you guys next time.